Good morning, everyone, and welcome to TBR's webcast, Moving Beyond Connectivity, Insight into the Enterprise Market Strategies of Leading Multinational Operators, which will delve into the enterprise strategy of multinational network operators. My name is Allison Crawford, and I will be your host for today's session. Steady declines in legacy enterprise voice and data revenues are forcing network operators to find new sources of growth. As enterprise customers look to new technologies to increase productivity and efficiency, network operators such as AT&T, Verizon, BT Global Services, Orange, and Vodafone are focusing on delivering more advanced and strategic services to grow revenue and profitability. Today, we'll discuss how this trend is changing the face of the market. Before I pass this over to Scott, there are a few logistics I'd like to cover. First, we'll be recording today's session and posting it on our YouTube site, TBRI channel. We encourage you to visit our channel to watch this presentation or any of the others that we've posted. Second, we'd like to hear your opinions and thoughts on the materials we're presenting. Please send any questions or comments to the Q&A or chat function. Scott will address them at the end of the presentation. Or if you'd like to set up a client inquiry for more detailed discussion, please reach out directly to Scott at the end of the session to set up that conversation. Third, we'll send out the slides to everyone registered for today's webcast within 24 hours of the conclusion of the webinar. You can also find these slides as well as other thought leadership pieces, webinar decks, and commentaries on SlideShare at www.slideshare.net/TBR_market_insight. Now let me introduce Scott Dennehy, Senior Analyst in Enterprise Networking. Scott has been working in the industry for the last 18 years. He is frequently called upon by our clients to improve strategic insight to help navigate this shifting marketplace. And with that, let me hand this over to Scott.
Thank you, Allison, and hello, everybody. Thanks for joining. So, as Allison said, what we're going to talk about today is the enterprise strategies or business strategies of some of the largest multinational network operators in the world, and Allison mentioned a few of them. So by the end of this webinar, there's really three things that I want to make sure that you take away. First and foremost, as Allison mentioned, the operators, by and large, are really looking for new sources of growth in the business market, and it's really more than just about growing their revenue. It's really about staying relevant. Obviously, there's a lot of transitions happening within the enterprise market, and technologies like cloud and mobility and security becoming really important to enterprise customers. So the operators are really trying to take advantage of that opportunity, and as I said, really trying to remain relevant in this changing landscape and move away from being the traditional network connectivity provider and becoming more of a strategic IT solutions provider. Secondly, there are a lot of strategies that these operators are utilizing to try to drive this growth and relevancy, as I mentioned. And we'll talk about a lot of these in more detail, but mostly to do with their resource management and go-to-market strategies. So things like expanding their infrastructure and enhancing their portfolios of offerings, and expanding into various geographies and emerging markets, and partnering with a variety of different vendors and partners around the world to help fill in the gaps that they may lack currently, either in terms of their portfolio or their geographic coverage. And lastly, I want to highlight a couple of areas that are really important to the operators, and that's mobility and cloud. These are really going to be key drivers for the operators in terms of their enterprise market, because ultimately these areas enable the operators to leverage some of the strengths and the heritage that they have around things like network connectivity and security. Both cloud and mobility are really heavily dependent on the network for those services to be delivered to enterprise customers and to allow their enterprise customers to have that really good user experience. And so that's an area that you'll see a lot of the operators focusing on as far as leveraging their strengths to drive growth. So first, if we look at this market from an overall perspective, as you may expect, there are lots of areas of growth and opportunity, but on the flip side of that, there are areas of conflict and competition. But if we look first on the left-hand side here and what the operators kind of have going for them with respect to the enterprise market, and there's really three key things as I see it. First is this demand for these next generation type of services, cloud, mobility, security, unified communications. These are really where the enterprise customers are focusing their budgets. So there's demand there that the operators can really take advantage of. And they're doing that in a couple of different ways. First is leveraging that history that they have with their enterprise customers as being that provider of network connectivity for a number of years. So they already have some relationships with the enterprise customers as providing these types of services, and they're really looking to leverage those relationships and move those customers from those legacy type of services into these next generation services. And lastly, it's developing these end-to-end solution portfolios that bring in not only their network services, but some of these other services that we'll talk more about as far as cloud and security as a couple of examples, and enabling or providing their customers with flexibility in terms of the delivery model. So not only being able to deliver or provide some of these services to customers in an on-premise type of scenario, but also offering options around hosted and cloud models. But on the flip side of that, there are obviously some things that are working against the operators here. And even though that there's a lot of demand for some of these next generation services, the spending environment overall in some of these core markets for these operators has been weak for a while now. And if you look at companies like in the U.S. like AT&T and Verizon and how reliant they are on sectors like the U.S. public sector for a lot of their revenue, and that sector's really been challenged from a spending point of view. And then going, on the other side of the world, across the Atlantic to Europe, and some of the challenges that the European market has had from an economic and a spending point of view, and how that's impacted companies like BT and Vodafone and Orange. So the spending environment's really been challenged for a lot of these operators over the last few years, and that's provided some challenges for them. The second piece of this is around the partnerships that these operators have and that they're going to try to use to penetrate some of these markets. You know, historically, as being mostly just a connectivity provider, there wasn't an issue with some of these other companies that the operators may have been working with, and I'm thinking about the IT services companies like IBM and HP, where for the most part these companies have been able to kind of coexist and not step on each other's toes. Well, that's really changing now as these operators get more entrenched in areas like cloud and security and all of these next generation segments. Well, there are a lot of other companies that are going after those same segments and try to deliver on the same kind of value proposition. So what's happening is that these partnerships are now becoming a little bit more competitive. And so it's really going to take some work and create some challenges for these operators to try to manage those relationships to make sure that they can still get some of the benefits of the partnership, but enable them to get some share from some of these companies as well. And then the last couple of areas that I see a lot of conflict for the operators is around their market perception. While the operators do have some strong relationships with these enterprise customers, I think there's still a perception out there from a customer point of view that they're just a telco, they're just a connectivity provider, and they're not quite viewed by the broader market as a strategic provider of IT solutions. So you're really seeing the operators work hard to try to change that around their messaging and the developing of the portfolios and the partnerships to try to change that perception from being just that provider of connectivity to a true strategic provider of IT solutions. And on the partner side, there's some perception issues as well. Again, in the past and even in the present day, most of these operators get a lot of their revenue direct from their customer. In some cases, that can be upwards of 80 or 90%. So the reputation of these operators in the channel is not a good one in terms of them being channel friendly. So that's another area that you're really seeing the operators focus heavily on, is investing in their channel partner programs to try to get more partners on board and starting to sell some of these solutions into the enterprise market. Now I'd like to just talk a little bit about the growth strategies that these operators are utilizing, and there are quite a few of them, but I think they fall into really four main buckets. The first being around their infrastructure. So expanding and investing in their network infrastructure, both in terms of fixed infrastructure and mobile infrastructure, which enables them to not only expand their reach and reach more customers, but deliver more high-value services for those customers. And that goes for their data centers as well. So building out and expanding the data centers, not only existing ones, but building new data centers in strategic markets to help deliver all of these services in cloud and hosted type of models. From the portfolio perspective, that is where we see the strategic services really coming into play, and I have a few of the really important ones listed there in terms of cloud, mobility, security, unified communications, and professional services. So it's not just expanding the types of, the number of services that they have or the types of services, but really what is the target end customer as well. So it's not just about targeting those large enterprise customers, but bringing some of these offerings that they had been delivering to large enterprises and now kind of retrofitting them, so to speak, and providing options for some of their small and medium business customers to take advantage of as well. Partnerships also really important for the operators, and there's really three flavors of those. I talked a little bit about the channel partners already, so really aggressive in terms of bringing partners on board, and not just general value-added resellers, but really targeting those partners that have some specialization, whether they are vertical specialization or geographic specialization, trying to bring those partners on board that can really bring value and open up some new customer bases for these operators. Technology partners, so these are the partners that the operators are really doing services around equipment. So these are companies like Cisco and Microsoft that are providing those actual products and solutions that the operators are wrapping services around or taking and delivering in a cloud or a hosted type of model. Unified Communications is a service, a good example here. So partnering with companies like Cisco and again companies like Microsoft and Avaya, and delivering those products in different types of ways, either as a resale channel directly into the enterprise, or again in delivering those solutions in a hosted or a cloud delivery model. And then lastly, the network partnerships. So as these multinational operators look to expand their reach globally, in most cases they're not going to be able to build their own network infrastructure in some of these countries. So that's where the partnerships come in terms of the network-to-network interface, or NNI types of partnerships, the network sharing agreements through things like telepresence, again opening up new markets for them or enabling their existing customers that may be based in their home market to communicate and get service in some of these other locations that they may be operating in. And then lastly, a lot of the growth is around restructuring their organizations to better target this market. So that comes through in really two areas. Number one, dedicated enterprise divisions. So historically, a lot of these operators really didn't necessarily have a focused enterprise division. They were selling to the enterprise, obviously, but there were solutions that and people that they had to leverage that were in other areas of the business. And that can create some challenges in terms of execution. So you've seen these operators reorganize and have some dedicated enterprise division that lets them better meet the needs of enterprise customers. A couple of good recent examples are Verizon, creating the Verizon Enterprise Solutions Group a couple of years ago. Vodafone, another good example. They've now got Vodafone Enterprise Services, which was driven a lot by their acquisition of Cable and Wireless. And then on the vertical side, like a lot of the other IT solutions providers out there, operators have recognized the value in a vertically oriented solution or operating model. So taking solutions from these different areas, whether it's cloud or mobility or security, and creating these customized industry-specific offerings. which allows them to drive more value and create more value within these verticals rather than selling on just a technology or just a particular segment. Now they can talk to their customers about business outcomes and how their solutions enable those. So if we think about all of these growth strategies that these operators are engaged in, really the question becomes, what's the result then? And I think if you look at it from at least a revenue perspective, you can see that the results really haven't been there. What you see on this chart here, this tracks the year-to-year business service revenue growth of really the 5 biggest multinational operators over the last few years. And what you see here is that for the most part, the revenues have been on a steady decline, and if we look at what happened in 2013, none of these operators were able to actually generate business service growth. And I think there are a variety of factors that have driven that, but I really think it comes down to a couple of really key things. First is how the rapid decline that these operators have seen in those legacy voice and data services. So as these customers move off of these legacy services and onto these next generation services, the decline has really outpaced the growth, so to speak. And that goes for the geographies as well, as the operators have seen a lot of growth in their emerging markets business. The decline in these developed markets, and U.S. and Europe good examples for some of those reasons I talked about earlier, that has really outpaced the growth in the emerging markets. So when you look at everything together, what you end up with is a revenue decline for most of these guys. I think the other piece of it that's important to note too is really around the execution. I think as much as the operators are really focused on this enterprise market, there are still obviously a lot of there's a culture really that still existed from the old telecom days, and that's a very highly bureaucratic, kind of slow-moving type of culture. And I think that's really been a challenge for the operators in terms of capitalizing on these growth opportunities and being able to pivot and shift their resources and really quickly capitalize on these opportunities. I think there's been a lot of challenges there. That certainly hasn't been helped by some of the acquisitions that these companies have made and trying to get their organizations restructured around these and get their operating models right. So I think that's really been a challenge too that's been inhibiting their growth from an enterprise perspective. But now I want to spend a few minutes talking about the strategic service, because that's really important for these operators in terms of their long-term growth. And I think when you look at most of these, really what you see is the strategy around these services is what I talked about at the outset, and that's how can these operators leverage their strengths and leverage the history that they have with these enterprise customers to drive growth in some of these solution areas. So really, if you look at most of these, and particularly the first 4 here, that theme really comes through. So for example, talking about cloud, the investments, the history that these operators have in network infrastructure and how important the network infrastructure is on cloud, and having the data centers and having the network infrastructure to deliver cloud in a secure way that customers really need. So what you're seeing from these operators is the investments in that network infrastructure and those data centers, and the messaging and the solutions around how important the network and not only just the network itself, but the security on that network is to delivering cloud. And I think the same goes for mobility. So just like on the consumer side for most of these operators, it's investing in that 4G LTE infrastructure. That certainly plays a role in the business world as well, and having that high-speed connectivity to be able to deliver those services, and looking at specific segments like M2M and how important the network is and the connectivity pieces around M2M, and then not only that, but moving from that connectivity into some of those higher value services around the applications that are involved with M2M. And then security, again, things like cloud security. Security is really still a big barrier to adoption when it comes to the cloud. And so what you're seeing from the operators is investments in cloud security, messaging around cloud security to help drive some of that adoption. Other areas like threat management, risk and compliance, very big areas that the operators are focusing on. Unified communications, I think this is really a great example of how the operators are leveraging what they've done historically in some of these legacy voice services and transitioning those customers over to these next generation type of services and video and collaboration and some of those kinds of things, and offering those multiple delivery models to tell a customer, hey, we can help you transition from your on-premise solutions and IP PBXs and shift that over towards more of a hosted or cloud model to save you money. Professional services, I think, is really interesting. This is definitely an area where the operators are now coming into contact in a competitive way with a lot of the IT services firms. And what you're seeing here is really investments in not only new services that they can deliver and try to build out that portfolio to provide more of an end-to-end type of solution, but in expertise. So how do they become more, how do they align themselves and how do they invest in expertise so that they can compete effectively with a lot of these companies that have been doing this for a number of years, Accenture, IBM, these others. So that's really where the focus is for these operators, is building their expertise and bringing in consultants that have the experience that is necessary to drive some credibility within the enterprise customer base. And what they're doing is really tying the professional services to some of these other areas. So professional services for cloud and mobility and security and unified communications. So staying on the strategic services, what you see here is just kind of a quick visual comparison of where we see these operators in some of these areas, and what this takes into account are really a variety of things like our assessment of each of these operators' strategy in these segments, what their portfolio and capabilities look like, and what we think the revenue performance has been. And I want to highlight a couple of different areas. First, around cloud. I think Verizon and AT&T are really the leaders here based on the investments that they've made. Verizon obviously has gotten a lot of benefit from their acquisition of Terramark, and they continue to drive very aggressively into cloud. I think AT&T has kind of been under the radar, so to speak, with respect to their messaging and marketing around cloud, but we really see them as a strong player. But I think as we move through 2014, these companies are going to see a bigger challenge from companies like BT and Orange that are also investing very aggressively in cloud, as well as Vodafone. I think the acquisition of cable and wireless is really key for them in cloud, and I think you'll see them continue to build their capabilities and become more of a challenger in cloud as we move through 2014. On the mobility side, no surprise here that most of these operators are very strong because they have that network assets that they can leverage and expand into other areas around mobility, whether that's mobile device management, mobile application management, some of those things that aren't necessarily specific to the network, but the network is really a differentiator for the operators here, and they're going to continue to leverage that. I think from BT's perspective, as many of you know, they don't own and operate their own mobile network, so that's why they're a little bit on the weaker scale here, although earlier last year they did purchase some wireless spectrum in the UK, so I think we'll see them get a little bit more active in the mobility sector, particularly around M2M and the Wi-Fi side. And lastly, on professional services, I talked a little bit about this already. I think the reason that most of these operators are kind of on the weaker end of the scale is because I don't think they quite yet have the level of expertise to kind of challenge some of the other IT players out there. I think BT is an exception. BT is a little bit more advanced in their professional services than some of these other operators, particularly when you look at how they're going to market across certain verticals, and particularly in the business consulting arena. So BT has a service they call BT Advise Horizons, which is more of a business consulting service, and I think that makes them unique compared to some of these other operators. So switching gears a little bit to talk about geography. So really the key takeaways here from a geographic perspective is really what the operators are after is those multinational customers. So they really want to follow their customers and go to where their customers are. So as their customers are growing into emerging markets, that's where you're seeing the operators make their investment. Obviously, the emerging market economies have been growing over the last few years much quicker than the developed markets, so that's where a lot of the multinational customers like Shell and Coca-Cola and Unilever and all these companies that have these operations all around the world are growing in these emerging markets. So that's where the operators are investing as well to try to make sure they can meet the needs of those customers, and you're seeing that through new facilities and data centers and offices in these emerging markets. And I have most of them highlighted here, as you might expect. There, the BRIC countries: Brazil, Russia, India, China, Middle East, Africa, Mexico. These are really the areas that we're seeing the most investment. What I think is interesting here is that although most of these operators are going after these same emerging markets, we're also seeing a little bit of a higher focus on some of the developed markets. If you look at the economic trends right now and how the spending is shifting, it's really been an opposite of what we've seen over the last couple of years. The emerging market economies are the ones that now appear to be slowing down a little bit, and the developed markets seem to be the ones that are recovering. And I think what you're seeing now is that the operators are now recognizing that and trying to shift their focus a little bit. And a couple of good examples of that are looking at a company like AT&T that's eyeing that European market. And there's been speculation around some acquisitions they may make there. I think if you look at Vodafone, they're a company that's getting more interested in the U.S. market, again, leveraging some of the network assets that they got through the cable and wireless acquisition that opened them up to some customers in that market. So I think what you'll see is a little bit of a shift in investment being not so aggressive in the emerging markets as they have been, and starting to look a little bit more closely at some of these developed markets and kind of go where the customers are going and going where the spending is going. So now that you understand kind of what's been going on in this particular market and what the operators are doing and really how they kind of compare against each other, now I'd like to look a little bit in the future and talk about where we see this market going now and really where are the opportunities. And I think it really comes down to three key things here. First, despite what I showed earlier around the lack of revenue growth that most of these, or all of these operators really are experiencing, I think they will remain committed to this market. The demand for these next generation services from the enterprise customers is clearly there, and I think that's really just going to grow into the future. And more importantly, the enterprise customers are showing a desire to buy from suppliers that can offer them a full range of services through a variety of different delivery models. So giving them the flexibility and the choice that they want, depending on what their needs are. That's really important to the enterprise customers, and I think the operators really feel like they have a strong value proposition from that perspective. So I think you're going to continue to see them focus on this enterprise market, regardless if that revenue growth isn't there in the short term. Secondly, but to really capitalize and really be successful ultimately, the operators really are going to have to evolve their business models to be able to capitalize on this market as it grows very quickly. I talked earlier about how they've really had a challenge kind of executing and capitalizing on these opportunities. So it's really going to be important for these operators to improve their execution in terms of delivery, in terms of the channel, all of those things to really take advantage of these opportunities and really try to shed the historical perception that they've had in terms of being that slow-moving provider of network connectivity rather than that strategic provider of IT solutions. But one thing we really haven't talked about yet, which I think is important to mention, is really the opportunity for vendors here, because the operators obviously are not ultimately the ones that are designing the solutions, the hardware and software that's really providing the basis of their offerings, right? So, but I think that the vendors in this case have an opportunity with these operators really in two areas. A, as really just a straight distribution channel for their solutions around the data center and networking and unified communications, as these operators again try to are really looking to provide these solutions in a variety of different ways. And the second piece of that is really these operators as customers. As this as-a-service model becomes more important and the operators look to deliver these hardware and software solutions in that way, the opportunity is there for the vendors to sell to those operators and have their solutions be the one that the operators are delivering in that as-a-service model. So lastly, I just want to highlight a little bit about where a lot of the information that you heard today comes from. And TBR has several syndicated reports that we write on an ongoing basis on all of these operators, and what I'm showing here is just a sample of the different topics that we cover, and you heard about a lot of these today. But really that's what drives a lot of the insight and the analysis that we do is around these regular syndicated reports that we're writing for our clients that allow us to engage with these operators and really study the market on a regular basis to really understand what's going on. And if you've got questions about these reports and what's contained in them, I'll be happy to answer those. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Allison for questions.
Great, thanks Scott, and thanks to those of you who have sent your questions through now. We've had a couple come through, and so I do encourage anyone that has any to send them through at this moment. We had one question come through. What are the key regulatory issues that will create tailwinds or headwinds for the telcos as they move into new services?
Well, that's a good question. Yeah, I mean, I think regulatory issues are certainly a big consideration, and I think that's what is a big driver of where you see the investment. And I know in Europe there are quite a few regulatory issues, around tariffs and those kinds of things that really kind of inhibit their growth. And I think that's a big reason why you see partnerships in a lot of these cases rather than straight investment in certain geographies. I think China is a good example of that, where you see a lot of the way that a lot of these operators are expanding into China is through partnership. So aligning themselves with a China Mobile or a China Telecom around a NNI partnership versus trying to go in and either acquire a company there or invest in infrastructure there. I think the regulatory issues are really key, and I think it varies from country to country. And I think it'd be no coincidence if you look at where the operators are really focusing more on partnership versus investment, kind of drives a lot of that.
Okay. The next question we have, what about Sprint and T-Mobile in the U.S.? Are they not targeting this market?
Yes, I purposely omitted Sprint and T-Mobile here because I really don't see them as targeting this market in the same way. Traditionally, I think T-Mobile is probably a better example, but both of those customers are really more focused on their consumer business and how do they compete and take subscribers from AT&T and Verizon. That said, they do have some small enterprise or business services division, mostly focused on mobile service plans and M2M. Although it does look like Sprint is becoming a little bit more interested in some of these areas like cloud and IT, and I think they're really looking at some of these areas to potentially get some more growth as they get some capital infusion from their SoftBank acquisition. But at this point, I really don't see them as major players in the space, particularly outside of the U.S. market. But again, I think if I had to pick, I'd say Sprint seems to be the one of the two that seems to be getting more interested and focusing a little bit more on this market in terms of looking at markets like cloud and IT and security.
Okay. The next question we had, Scott, what are these companies doing to enable them to demonstrate the value these services offer to business executives and end users? And this is not a phone service sale.
Right. Yeah, you're absolutely right. So I think this comes down to messaging, and I think the vertical piece is really important here. TBR has done quite a bit of research in terms of understanding what customer buying behaviors are, and not only that, but really who the buyers are. So it's not, and things are really changing on the enterprise market in terms of it's not just about selling to IT anymore. There are lines of business now that are getting involved in these types of decisions and IT purchases. And so I think what you're seeing the operators doing, and this goes for other companies as well, it's not just about what a technology solution can do to solve your problem, it's how does this solution enable a business outcome. So again, this is where I think the vertical piece really comes in, because now you're talking to a marketing executive for a retail company and talking to them about how your solution can help enable a business outcome, whether it's how to drive sales in their retail stores or whatever that is. And there may be multiple components within that solution, whether it's mobile connectivity and digital signage and all this kind of stuff that forms into one solution that helps enable a particular business outcome. So I think that's really where you're seeing the operators now start to focus their messaging around these verticals and how their solution helps enable a business outcome versus solves a particular IT problem.
The next question, Scott. What has been the impact of voice over IP providers like Comcast and Vonage?
Yeah, I think to a certain degree that has had a little bit of an impact on these operators from the point of view as moving off of fixed line and voice over IP, and I think it's a similar trend that you see on the consumer side. I personally don't have a fixed phone line anymore. I get voice over IP phone service from Comcast, and I think you're seeing the same kind of thing on the business side, although I think that's mostly happening at the SMB level. So companies like Comcast and Vonage have programs and plans for small and medium business-sized customers, and that's really been their focus. So I think the biggest impact from those voice over IP providers has been on the small and medium business side. I really don't think you've seen an impact there yet on the large enterprise side, nor do I think you will.
Okay, we just had another question come through, Scott. What do you believe will make one more successful among others? What about threat from non-operator players?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's really the crux of it is how do these operators differentiate against these non-operator players? In terms of to answer the first part of that, as far as what do I think will make one more successful among others, it really comes down to which one of these can shed that reputation away from customers and partners thinking of them as a telco, as a connectivity provider, into an IT solutions provider. So whoever can do that the best, I think, is the one is the one that's going to be the most successful. And if I had to pick one right now, I think the one that seems to be the leader from that perspective is Verizon. I think they've done a pretty good job in terms of their messaging and in terms of the solution development and leveraging their early lead and success in areas like cloud. Whether or not they can continue that or whether or not these other operators catch up remains to be seen. But I think if I had to pick one, I'd say Verizon. And I think that ties into the next question around the threat from non-operator players, because operators aren't the only ones that are going after these markets and like cloud and mobility and bringing and messaging around these same kind of things around business outcomes and end-to-end solutions and those kinds of things. So that's why the operators really are focusing on still trying to say, look, we're not IBM because we can do all the same kind of things as IBM does, but we also have these network assets that we can leverage that we've been delivering for years to enterprise customers and tying those offers in to cloud. So a good example is what AT&T is doing with NetBond, right? So it's taking advantage of trends around cloud, but using their network assets to try to overcome some of the barriers to adoption and telling customers, hey, you can get all of the security and the privacy and the control you get from a private cloud in a public cloud scenario using AT&T's NetBond service. So those are that's a specific example of where I think AT&T is trying to differentiate against some of these non-operators.
Okay. We have one more question in queue, so if anyone has any additional questions, send them through now, please. Last question, Scott. What's your assessment of Vodafone's acquisition of Cable and Wireless? Has it been successful?
Well, I guess it depends on which perspective you look at it from. I think from a financial perspective, it has yet to really bear fruit. Cable and Wireless was really struggling prior to the acquisition, and a lot of that had to do with the fact that they really weren't or hadn't invested in a lot of these strategic services that I've talked about. And so part of, I think Vodafone's gotten what they expected in terms of, or at least understood they were getting themselves into from a financial perspective. And I don't think you've seen that turn around quite yet. I think Cable and Wireless has still been quite a drag on their enterprise business. But I think overall, I think they've done a good job with integration, and you're starting to see some of the fruits of what they've been doing around Cable and Wireless, and I think it really plays into their strategy around converged offers and geographic expansion. And I think it really helps Vodafone in a couple of different ways. First and foremost, in their home market of the UK, giving them access to a lot of kind of long-term and lucrative government contracts that Cable and Wireless had. So I think that was important for them. And it lets them get some of the fixed network assets that line up very nicely with some of the markets that Vodafone has a strong presence in from a mobile perspective. So that's places like Africa and India and some of these areas that Vodafone's been growing into from a mobile perspective. They've got a lot of fixed network assets now in those same countries that they can leverage. So I think short answer is good job, good progress on the integration. Haven't quite seen the results show up from a financial perspective yet.
Thanks for that, Scott. We do not have any other questions in queue right now, so with that, I'm going to take a start to wrap up the webinar. So I want to thank everyone for your attending today, and thanks for Scott for taking time for the presentation. Wanted to encourage everyone through social media to follow both Scott as well as TBR on Twitter at the handles linked in above, and I'll give Scott a shameless plug to reach out to him on LinkedIn as well. You can find him there and connect with him. And as we mentioned, we will be posting all of this information both to SlideShare and to YouTube. So if you'd like to pass along the slides or have some of your colleagues watch the presentation, you'll be able to do that tomorrow. We'll send those out to you. As you are leaving the webinar, we have a quick survey. It's 3 questions. How valuable was the presentation? How good was the presenter? And if there's any other open feedback, whether it's on our research agenda or comments about the presentation, that'd be great if you can give us your feedback. We do value that, and we take your comments very seriously. Wanted to point out we have several webinars that are coming up over the next several months, a lot on cloud, as Scott had mentioned. We also have some webinars that are coming out of Scott's practice on network function virtualization on May 20th, and Scott will be doing another webinar on June 17th on software-defined networking. So we do encourage you to follow those as well. And you can go to our website, which we've just launched a refresh, so you can find the press release that has all the webinar links as well as other thought leadership pieces. If you want to take a look, I do encourage you to do that. So thanks again, everyone, for your time today, and we look forward to connecting with you again over the next several months. And if you have any questions, please reach out to either Scott or myself. Have a great afternoon, everyone.